I was really, really surprised. North Carolina is possibly the most important meat-producing state in the country. And the animal agriculture lobby is really powerful and really scary. And I'm also sure it contributes a good bit of money to both institutions. And I was actually blown away by the bravery of choosing this book. And what makes me so happy is precisely what was said in the introduction, which is the point is not that we should all do anything. The point is not an answer to a question. The point is to ask questions and to ask provocative questions and to really wrestle with them. And that to me is the singular purpose of an education, and of a college education in particular, is to just constantly be asking things. It does not matter if you agree with your neighbor. It does not matter to me, frankly, if you strongly disagree with me. The problem I have is when somebody says, yeah, I just don't want to know about it. Almost all of my friends eat meat, and I have no problem respecting them. I've eaten meat for most of my life. What I have a hard time respecting is the person who says, I don't want to read that book because then I probably have to change. Or I really don't want to get involved with that because it's just an uncomfortable subject. And maybe 50 years ago, maybe even when I was in college, you could responsibly or ethically take that stance toward the world, but the world has changed in such dramatic ways. And unfortunately, you're going to bear a lot of the responsibility of reversing some of the trends that were put in place by the generation before you, and this is definitely no exception. Global warming, of which animal agriculture is the #1 cause, is something that just can't wait, and it's something that we don't have the luxury of saying, yeah, I don't really want to think about that, or it's probably uncomfortable. So as I was saying, this is a subject that is perceived as being controversial. I imagine that when you guys, at least some of you, when you found out that you had to read a book called Eating Animals, you probably thought, I'd rather not. During the summer, do I really want to do that? I've seen many, many times people in bookstores, particularly in airplane bookstores for some reason, pick up the book, take a look at it. Already you can see like a cloud of doubt come over their head. And then they read the description on the back, and they think about it for a second, and they put it back on the shelf. And I don't blame them for that response, and I wouldn't blame any of you for any hesitancy you might have had about approaching this book. I feel very hesitant about it. I don't like thinking about it. I don't love talking about it. I think it's worth examining, though, why we have those hesitations and what we can do to correct them. I think we have those hesitations because we share some instincts. I don't think that they're liberal or conservative. I don't think that they are young or old or urban or rural. I think we share instincts about what's right and what's wrong, and that's reflected in our shared discomfort about this subject. Unfortunately, the subject is often presented in ways that make it particularly unappealing. There's a stereotype of a kind of holier-than-thou vegetarian and a finger-wagging vegetarian. And those are stereotypes because such people exist. I've encountered such people in my life. I have walked down many streets and avoided people holding posters that say things like, meat is murder. I think it's a bad strategy if the goal is to really engage most people. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, is probably the most successful advocacy group in American history. And they've taken a certain strategy, which is, we are willing to alienate 4 out of 5 people if we captivate 1 out of 5. And that 1 out of 5 makes them enormously important and enormously successful. And they have, the fact that more people know PETA as an animal advocacy group than a bread testifies to how successful they've been. But they lose 4 out of 5 people. And if this is a really serious, pressing, local, national, and global problem, we can't afford to lose 4 out of 5 people. So we have to find a better way of talking about it. always kind of stupefies me that this is a subject that really moral and moralizing people don't like to touch. It's a subject that philosophers generally don't like to touch, despite it being so explicitly philosophical. And also that religious leaders don't like to touch. You very, very rarely hear religious leaders talking about the problems with animal agriculture. And as I was saying before, I think a lot of this has to do with the framing of the question. You know, are we asking the right question, and are we asking it in the right spirit? So if you were to ask 100 Americans, taken at random, right, not just from Berkeley or New York, but all over the country, every gender, religion, age, race, and so on, do you think it's right to kill animals for food? Probably about 96 of them would say yes. It's perfectly right to do. And probably about 4 of them would say no. So you could end there, or you could ask different questions. You could say, not is it theoretically right to do this thing, but are the ways that we're doing it right? Is it right to have a farm system, for example, that is, according to the United Nations, not according to PETA, but according to the United Nations, the #1 cause of global warming? Is it, and unnecessarily so? Is it right to have a system of animal agriculture that's one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet, locally and globally? Air pollution, water pollution, loss of biodiversity, deforestation. You're going to find those same 96 people who said it's perfectly right to eat animals saying it's not right to have that system. And similarly, when you talk about animal welfare, if 96 people think it's right to kill animals for food, the same 96 people are going to say, but we should give some thought to how we do it. About 95% of Americans think that animals deserve legal protection, which is an amazing statistic. It's hard to think of anything that 51% of Americans agree on anymore, but 95% implies a pretty complete consensus. And 76% of Americans think that farmed animals, not just dogs and cats, but farmed animals, deserve strict legal protection. Not just legal protection, but really something robust and rigorous from cruelty. So it's a very peculiar position if you just stop and think about it, because almost everybody agrees that how we treat animals matters. I'm not saying that we want to invite them into our bedrooms. You know, I'm not saying that we need to name them. I'm not saying that we need to love them. I actually don't really love animals. My first visit when I wrote Eating Animals was to a farm sanctuary, which is a place that takes animals that were in one way or another rescued from factory farms and allows them to live out their lives. And I thought this would be a good thing to do, just to, you know, get to spend a day with some pigs and cows and chickens and see what they're all about, because I hadn't really done that in any sort of thoughtful way in my life before. And the fact of the matter is, I wanted to go pretty much as soon as I got there. I just didn't find it all that interesting. I didn't feel like sitting with these animals. I didn't feel like petting them. Nevertheless, there are certain things that are wrong. There are ways of treating them that are wrong. And I think if you sort of investigate yourself and then also ask around within your community, you'll find that we really pretty much agree about what's wrong. You know, who is the person, for example, that wants to put a pregnant pig in a cage so small that it can't turn around? You just won't find such a person. Nobody will say, that scene, I'm indifferent to that. I have no opinion whatsoever about that. Some people might think it's a huge crime, some people might think it's merely unfortunate, but everybody, or just about everybody, will agree that it's not something that we want. So we're in this very odd position where we have this agreement about how we should treat animals, a loose agreement, that at least it matters. And we also have an agreement that our relationship to the environment matters. Some people continue to insist that global warming isn't happening, but everybody agrees that the quality of the air we breathe matters. You know, who on planet Earth would disagree with that? Everybody agrees that the quality of the water we drink matters. And so here we have, neatly on our plate, our most important relationship to animals and our most important relationship to the environment, and yet we have an extraordinarily, I would even say, radically hard time talking about it. And I think one of the real problems is that we've created this black and white proposition, like a dichotomy. And in a way, vegetarianism, while it might be the most elegant solution to the problem, has exacerbated the problem. Because it suggests that you either are or you're not. You know, like if you care about these things, you're a vegetarian. And otherwise, you don't. These are the two stances we can take. Because if you were to fall anywhere in between those two things, to acknowledge that it's important, but you're not a vegetarian for whatever reason, then you're just a hypocrite. And that's what everybody seems to be most afraid of. We're so afraid of hypocrisy that we would rather be completely ignorant or completely blind than allow any small bit of hypocrisy into our lives. It's not a coincidence that, you know, anyone in here who's a vegetarian has experienced this, but probably everyone's experienced some form of it or witnessed it. You know, when one person says to another, hey, why aren't you eating that food? And person B says, because I'm a vegetarian. And then person A comes right back with, but your belt is leather, or but your shoes are leather, or but I saw you swat a fly the other day. You know, we want to go right to the extreme of the argument, because if that person isn't perfect, that person's a hypocrite. And this is a real problem. And what's so strange about it is we don't apply that kind of dichotomy to any other ethical realm in our lives. Like, think about the environment. Most of us like to think of ourselves as being environmentalists in one way or another. So at home, you know, we try to buy good appliances. I use those crazy light bulbs whenever I can. I turn off lights when I leave a room. I wouldn't leave my car idling for no reason. I try not to drive my car unless I have to. And yet I flew here from New York this morning, which I know is, in terms of, you know, personal transportation, like the worst thing you can do. It leaves the largest carbon footprint. But I didn't get off the plane and call home and say, turn the lights on and leave the car idling and open the refrigerator. It's crazy. It's not like because of that sudden infringement I had to give up on the proposition altogether. And yet, many, many times I've met vegetarians who say, oh, I was a vegetarian for 6 years. And I say, what happened? And they say, well, I was in an airport late one night and I was incredibly hungry and the only thing open was whatever, KFC, and the only thing they had was chicken, and so I ate some. And I say, so what? Like, then what? And I say, well, that was the end of my vegetarianism. You know, imagine if, like, I try to be an honest person in life. Let's say my mother comes down the stairs Saturday night, she's wearing a dress, she says, what do you think? If I say to her, I think you look nice, even though it's maybe not my favorite dress of hers, it's not like I'm going to then take every available opportunity to lie. You know, so I just think, okay, so I maybe didn't speak as honestly as I might have in this one instance. It doesn't undermine everything that I care about. And yet with food, we've created this weird thing where you're either on this end or you're on that end. And there's absolutely no room in the middle. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was create a room in the middle that people could occupy without feeling guilty and without feeling hypocritical, to say, you know, this stuff really matters to me. I'm not going to be a vegetarian. Maybe because I just like meat too much. You know, maybe because it doesn't fit with the particular constraints of my lifestyle. Whatever reason. People have different reasons. That person should have a way to engage with the subject and to care about it. And that was what I wanted to do with it, with my book, was to expand this middle space. So before the book was published, I was really concerned about what would happen when it came out, because I had this impression that it was such a controversial subject. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who had written quite an important book about food, not about meat exactly, but about food in America. And he said, let me give you 2 pieces of advice. One, get a lawyer and have this lawyer read your book very carefully, because big food, but particularly the meat industry, has been known to very aggressively sue people who in any way criticize it, even if it's a frivolous lawsuit. Oprah was famously sued by, I think it was the Texas meat lobby, for having said on one of her shows, wow, after learning about what goes into hamburgers, I'm never going to eat a hamburger again. And the suit went on for 7 years. And she won, because of course she won, because what did she do wrong? But you don't want to be in a lawsuit for 7 minutes, much less 7 years. And he also said you might consider getting a bodyguard, because he was describing to me situations he'd had in readings where very intimidating people approached him in a very intimidating manner. So because it's the nature of my personality to sort of latch on to such warnings, I thought about this a lot. And I imagined, I thought, my first reading was in New York, and I thought, this could be really ugly. And I started to play out scenarios. What would I do? What would I do if somebody stood up and threw a piece of meat at me? For some reason, I embodied all of my concerns in that gesture. And I decided what I would do is, the way it would play out is somebody would stand up and say, screw you, whatever, throw a hamburger at me. Some Barnes & Noble security guard, should such a person even exist, would go up to that meat thrower and say, all right, let's get out of here. And then I would say, no, wait. And I would invite the person onto the stage. And first I would try to decimate him mentally. Obviously it would be a him. A woman would not do this. And then I would invite him to, I would be good-humored and funny about it, and say, let's have a meat duel. And he would take his piece of meat and we'd split it into two, because then I would prove that, see, I'm not grossed out by meat. That's not what this is all about. I'm not disgusted by it. I'm not some kind of sissy. And then we would go back to back and walk 10 paces and turn around and throw it at each other, and everybody would realize that I was better than he was. But this never happened, and nothing remotely like it happened. What happened was that I found wherever I spoke, whether I was speaking to college students or speaking to book reading attendees in a city, or speaking to farming communities, which I did quite a bit of, speaking to farmers, or speaking to chefs, I found the same thing wherever I went. Wherever I went, it was always the same response, which is, wow, factory farming is bad. This is a real problem. There's just got to be some better way of doing this. One curious aspect of the response was a lack of response from the meat industry. It seems strange. It almost defies belief. If I wrote a book about Duke, let's say, and I said, Duke is a bad school, and here are the reasons why it's bad, and here are the reasons why you should not go there, and why we should withdraw any kind of support from it, why we might even consider making it illegal. I assure you there would be a response. Probably many responses, probably from many different people. Maybe the Alumni Association would write to me, maybe the dean would write to me, probably students would write to me, and they would be right to write to me. They would say, no, you're wrong, you've got your facts completely wrong. Or they would say, there's another way of looking at it. Nobody's perfect, no organization is perfect, but there's another way of looking at it. I got no such response from any arm of the meat industry, and there are many, many arms of the meat industry. I was speaking earlier with one of the hosts today about the responses the university got from the meat industry, and apparently they were extremely limited, as I understand it, maybe a letter or 2 letters, despite the fact that the most important learning institutions in the state were assigning as a book for every incoming freshman to read a critique of the meat industry. So what does it say? That they didn't respond at all. It says either that they kind of wave a white flag and surrender, like you're right, you're absolutely right, everyone should stop eating the products that we produce, or they recognize what everybody really knows, which is the more you think about this, the less likely you are to want to support it. It is never the case that learning about factory farming makes you more tempted to eat factory farm meat. it never happens. It is never the case that people engage with the facts about the industry and all of the environmental repercussions and the human health repercussions and the animal welfare issues and feels more comfortable. Everybody always feels less comfortable. And so the industry made a choice about 10 years ago, simply never to respond to anything, because responding only expands the conversation, and it's a conversation that they want contracted. They rely on people being lazy. They rely on people being forgetful. And the reason that I'm so, to return to one of the first things I said, happy to be here, is because the entire point of a college education is to expand conversations. Expand conversations that might naturally contract, or that there are forces in the world that encourage us to contract them or not to think about them. So I've been a little bit lazy about terminology so far. I've been talking about meat sometimes, and I've been talking about factory farming sometimes. My book is really a book about factory farming. In fact, some of the strongest advocates, I had thought when I published the book that animal rights groups would treat me like Moses, and anyone who was in any way involved with the meat industry would treat me like a villain. And it hasn't been the case at all. That's probably the strongest critiques that I've gotten have been from the animal rights movement, saying, why did you go further? Why did you leave any room for people to eat meat? Why are you condoning these small and family farms? And frankly, the strongest support that the book has gotten has probably been from farmers. And that's because nobody hates factory farming like farmers do. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to define factory farming, because it's more of a mindset than any particular group of technologies. But generally speaking, what factory farming is a perversion of the way that farming has been done for all of human history until about 50 years ago. For all of human history, farmers looked to nature as a guide, as a model. Factory farming said, well, maybe actually nature is an obstacle to be overcome. Maybe the sun shouldn't reflect when animals get light. Maybe there's a better way, an artificial way of generating lightness and darkness cycles. Maybe sick animals are actually better than healthy animals, as crazy as that sounds. Maybe there's a way of looking at it, a way of squinting your eyes so that it's closer to what we want. Maybe it's better to feed animals antibiotics from birth until death, instead of not doing so, or instead of only feeding animals medicine when they need it. Maybe it doesn't make sense to feed animals the foods that their bodies naturally digest, which also, in most cases, happen to be foods that humans can't eat, like grass. And instead, feed them animals that their bodies can't naturally digest because they're either cheaper or they will make them grow at a quicker rate. Maybe environmental destruction is in some way better than environmental sustainability. The environmental destruction that comes from factory farming isn't an accident. And anyone who says it is being disingenuous. The company Smithfield, which is the largest pork producer in the country, had 7,000 violations of the Clean Water Act in 1 year. So if they'd had 50, we would say, that's not good. If they'd had 200, we would say, somebody should really keep a better, closer eye on this company. But 7,000 starts to sound like a business model. And it starts to sound deliberate. It starts to sound like somebody who is getting away with everything they're allowed to get away with, and unfortunately, in this case, they're allowed to get away with anything. So, this kind of farming that I just described gives us 99% of the meat that's available in supermarkets and in restaurants. If you eat meat and you don't actively seek out an alternative, you're eating factory farm meat. It's pretty much the only thing that's available, and it's certainly the only thing that's easily available. But it's not the only thing that exists. There is another kind of meat. The kind that was the only kind that existed 50 years ago. But now is you can only really find in green markets or farmers markets, or maybe at a university like this, they actually do try to source their meat from small and family farms. That kind of meat is not something that I am necessarily opposed to. And if that were the only thing that existed in the world, I certainly wouldn't have written this book. The challenge is to know which is which, and it's very, very hard. The challenge is to correct our mental image. You know, when most people think of farms, they think of grass and animals outside, and like a farmer maybe with a pitchfork and overalls and sunshine and all of that. And that has nothing to do with farming anymore. And yet we continue to think about it, and we continue to have this mental image reinforced by the language that is used on labeling, like fresh and natural and happy cows and all of that. And the images, you know, think about the images you see on meat. It is never an image of a windowless shed. I have never seen this. It is always the image of something that doesn't correspond to what you're buying. And this should really upset us. You know, the fastest growing sector of the food industry in America right now is cage-free eggs. In all of America, this is the food item that is growing most quickly. It's a food that does not taste better and is not better for our health, and yet that people are buying everywhere in the country because of our good instincts, because we think it's just not right, you know, to pack animals of any kind in these cages that are so small that they can't extend their limbs. The problem is, because people want it, and because the egg industry realizes that they can sell it for a higher price, they deceive us, they manipulate us, they apply language that is put there simply to confuse us. And it should really make everybody furious. So, I want to end by just saying a little bit about why I approach this subject in the first place. I'm not a journalist of any kind. I don't think I'll ever write a nonfiction book again. I'm not an activist. I'm not an animal person. I'm not an environmentalist any more than anyone else in this room is. And I'm no kind of philosopher. But I am someone who's had a discomfort about this issue for pretty much my whole life. When I was 9, I tell the story in the book, we had a babysitter who wouldn't eat the chicken that my older brother and I were eating. And we asked her why, and she said, "Oh, I just don't really want to hurt anything unless I have to." And I thought that that was such an amazing revelation, actually. I mean, I knew that chicken was chicken, but I just hadn't really thought about it. I hadn't allowed myself to think about it. And I found that I had no response to her. And I have to admit, I still have no response to her. And so that night, I became a vegetarian. And about a week later, I started eating meat again. Just because, for the reason everybody eats meat. Because it tastes good, and it smells good, and it's there, and it's what we're used to. But I never got over my discomfort. And I expressed that discomfort in different ways through my life. Between the ages of 9 and about 28, I probably became a vegetarian 30 times. You know, because when I would remember, when I would have a reason to remember, maybe I saw a video, maybe I heard a fact, maybe I read a book, I couldn't ignore it. I just couldn't be myself while continuing to eat these things. But then I found ways to continue to be myself while eating these things. And it was an ongoing conversation. When my wife became pregnant with our first child, suddenly the conversation felt very, very different. It took on an urgency it didn't have before, because as you guys who, if you have children, you'll find that the choices you make on your children's behalf feel a lot more serious than the choices that you make for yourself. And I felt that quite strongly with food. So I just decided, you know what, I'm going to figure this out once and for all. Not in any global way, not in any way that I would suggest to anyone else, but just for myself. I just want to figure out what I'm comfortable with, because this subject, whatever you think about it, it really matters. It really, really matters. It matters to your health, it matters to your local and national communities, it matters to the environment, and it matters to animals. And I thought, let's see what's going on. And so I'm going to end with the way that I began my research, which was a letter that I wrote. I thought that what I would do is a bit of Googling, a bit of reading, and maybe go to a farm or two. This would take me a month, and then I would reach some kind of happy resolution, whatever it was. In the end, it took me about 3 years. And I ended up going to farms all over the country, speaking to dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and learning more than I ever thought I would learn, and frankly more than I ever cared to learn about where meat comes from. But it began with letters like this. To whom it may concern at Tyson Foods, I'm following up on my previous letters of January 10th, February 27th, March 15th, April 20th, May 15th, and June 7th. To reiterate, I'm a new father, eager to learn as much as I can about the meat industry, in an effort to make informed decisions about what to feed my son. Given that Tyson's Food is the world's largest processor and marketer of chicken and beef, your company is an obvious place to start. I would like to visit some of your farms and speak with company representatives about everything from the nuts and bolts of how your farms operate to animal welfare and environmental issues. If possible, I would also like to speak with some of your farmers. I can make myself available at just about any time and on relatively short notice, and I'm happy to travel as is needed. Given your family-centered philosophy and your most recent "It's What Your Family Deserves" advertising campaign, I assume you'll appreciate my desire to see for myself where my son's food comes from. Thanks so much for your continued consideration. Best, Jonathan Safran Ford. So obviously they never responded, and Tyson is not worse than anyone else. Nobody responded. And so I had to find other ways of seeing what the inside of a farm looked like. But if nothing else persuades you that this is an important conversation to have, that should persuade you. The secrecy, the fact that there's no industry in the country except for the military that is as secretive as the meat industry, and there's no industry that that trusts its consumers less with information. So, in the spirit of education, I would very strongly encourage you to ask the questions that don't want to be asked, to take a package of meat from your refrigerator, look at the company name, and just call them. And just say, I'm just curious. This guy came and talked to us about this stuff, and I guess I can't quite believe that what he said was true, so I want to learn for myself. Can you prove to me that what he said isn't true? And if any of you so much as get a response, much less some kind of reason to think that what they're doing is something that you can, with open eyes and honesty, condone, I would really love to hear about it. So, on that note, I think the best use of our time, our remaining time, is probably for me to try to answer your questions, tell you a little bit more about the process. And I'd also be quite eager to hear from you about your own thoughts and experiences. And please, disagreeing with me is in fact the most productive way we could spend our time. I'm always happier, I'm very happy to hear when somebody says I became a vegetarian or I eat differently because of your book, but in a certain way I'm even happier to hear from people who very strongly disagree with me. So I would encourage that to a point. And just think, this will be the first question